Welcome to Knock Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Controversial Issues with Rabbi Chaim Coffman. Chaim, check me, Coffman, in the white corner. Today's episode, more proof of divine authorship of the Torah. Welcome back. Don't smoke crack, Rabbi. How are you, sir?
Very good. You have to get that in.
Yeah,
it's. Get that in. No.
We all have to agree.
I was like, oh, maybe he's not going to do it this week.
Listen, we all have to agree. It is really good advice, no matter how you look at it. It's really great advice. So, yes, not applicable to probably any of our viewers, but it's still good advice, wouldn't you say? Oh my gosh! So how are you doing, sir? How was your week?
We're in a heat wave, major heat wave
I
here.
heard.
We had the blackouts all over the country on Shabbos. Imagine, it's 100 degrees or like 40 degrees Celsius, and no air, no fans, eating by candlelight, just like
you don't have
like they used to do without electricity. It was like pretty amazing.
Okay, you seriously don't have air conditioner?
Go to sleep.
You don't have air conditioning?
No, we had everything, but everything was down. Half the neighborhood on both sides was down until about midnight. Until midnight Friday night. Most of Friday afternoon till about midnight. About 10 hours. They had we didn't have electricity, and it was we had most of the food cooked already. I had to cook a few other things, by my son-in-law or whatever. But we had mostly everything done. But whatever, it's just when it's hot. You know what they say, when it's cold, you can put on extra layers.
Right.
When it's hot, there are only so many layers you can take off. So
right.
It was
right.
It was pretty hot. I mean, still pretty still pretty hot now. It's supposed to clear. It's supposed to get cooler in the next few days, but down south in Eilat, it hit 132.
Where?
132 Fahrenheit.
Who had 132? Who?
You take an egg, that sucker's gonna be fried.
Rabbi,
nothing to talk.
Who hit 100?
That makes Texas look like a bunch of pansies in the summer. Come on.
Where did 132 hit? Where was it? 132.
Eilat.
Eilat,
down south.
Oh wow! Holy cow!
All the way down south.
Man.
It's pretty hot there anyway, but 132 is like, I think it's like 50 degrees Celsius or something. It's like insane.
Wow.
It's like you want to feel what hell is like, just go there. That's it. That's in this world. I mean, it doesn't really get that hot. It gets over 100 a lot, but in the summer, but it's certainly not quite that hot. But that's pretty intense.
That is incredibly intense. Wow, no kidding. Now, to be fair,
take an egg, fry it. I was gonna try it outside. Take an egg and fry it in the car.
The cool thing is, I do have a point of reference for that, by the way.
Yeah.
Because of being in construction, I've been in attics in the middle of summertime where temperatures were 130, 140 degrees. You can only stay up there like 10 minutes at a time and without suffocating. Yeah, it's very something not to play around with. That's for sure.
Yeah. No, 100%. So.
Right on.
Whatever, thank God for, whatever. The electric company came, took care of it. And, it was funny because some people had part electricity and some people had no electricity. And it was like that by the street. Some people had, some people didn't. It was like a whole thing. But Jerusalem, many places didn't have. Other places didn't have. Wow. It was all over. It's like, it's just people just using, I guess, too much, too much wattage, as they say. It was just unbelievable.
No kidding, dang. Okay. All right, well, I'll be quiet and let you do your thing now. So if you want to go ahead and hop on to your Coffman train, and we'll see what happens.
Well, I got an hour and 50 minutes to go, so we got plenty of time here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
We'll see if the electricity holds up.
I was going to say.
In any case, we digress here. We're speaking about, proof of God's existence. One thing that, a little bit controversial that I thought we'd hit, which would be, speak about archaeology. Right, archaeology, a very interesting topic. There's a lot of historical information, certainly in the Torah itself, and we got to see, if what the Torah says can actually somehow be proven. Why? Because the Torah, what does the Torah speak about? Torah speaks about the lives of the patriarchs, speaks about wars, migrations, famines, speaks about marriages, all kinds of things. The question that we've thrown out the last number of weeks is, can I see, even from a logical perspective, right? Forget about, okay, God said it, Moshe wrote it. Can I see from a logical perspective 100% that the Torah is true? Right? So we're looking at the reliability of the Torah itself. Right? So now, how are we going to test that? So one thing is there'll be many people on the other side. And on the other side, that means they're going to say, you know what? Who's to say the Bible's true? Why should we make such an assumption? Now, the question is going to be, okay, do I have proof? Can I show from any other ancient record? Can I show from, let's say, ancient hieroglyphics? Can I show from Syrian records, Babylonian records, right? Jews were in Babylonia for a long time. So we would check the Bible against them, right? And see if it pans out. Now, what would I think? I would think, okay, if the Bible agrees with them, very good, right? That should be an indication the Bible's true, that the Bible's correct. Now, if the Bible disagrees with them, what would my assumption be? My assumption is the Bible is incorrect. So that should be a neutral way of assessing whether the Bible's account of history is true or it's not true, right? There's only one problem, right? The $1 million question over here is that really something that's fair? In other words, if the Bible corroborates these other things, hieroglyphics and whatever, why am I going to assume that means that the Bible is true? In other words, if, let's say, the Bible contradicts, right? Maybe the Bible is going to contradict other hieroglyphics. Maybe it's going to contradict science. What do we assume, right? We all know what happens when you make assumptions. But what's the assumption? The assumption is if there's a contradiction between the Bible and science, or hieroglyphics, or any of these other things, the assumption is the Bible's not true. That is normally the assumption. Now, why can't we turn it on its head? Why can't we say that maybe we assume the Bible's true and that these other things are wrong, right? A contradiction means somebody's wrong, right? You can't, both people cannot be right, right? Both sides 100% can't be right. Right? So the assumption normally is the Bible's wrong. Now, obviously, if you're going to say the Bible's wrong straight away, then obviously you have a hidden prejudice, right? That prejudice goes against the Bible because you're saying any little contradiction, oh, look, science must be true. It's been documented. Must be the Bible's not true, right? Well, why do I say science isn't foolproof? Other things are not necessarily foolproof, but there's an inherent prejudice. Gonna go on record. It's a good thing we're taping this. Gonna go on record and say there's a tremendous prejudice in order to say that the Bible may be true. Nobody wants to necessarily make such a statement because if they make such a statement, that obligates them, right? We saw by Einstein, we saw by Hawking, right? Saw by others, they did not want to entertain the possibility that 100% that the Bible is true. They want to analyze it through science, and if they don't have an answer, they're still not going to say that the Bible is true. Why not? Very simple, because they don't want to be obligated. They don't want to say, okay, now I'm limited. Now I can't do this, and now I can't do that, etc. So if I have a contradiction between the Bible and any other ancient source, so now we have to ask the question. Right? We have to ask the question, who's right and how do I know? Right? So how can we understand this contradiction? And how do we know who to rely on? Right? That is, that's going to be the focus of what we're going to see. But the question is really turned on its head. Right? Because normally you say, well, there's a contradiction. Science says that what to the world, 5 billion years old, 10 billion years old. Right? We're still 5,700 years, right? 80 years, 81 years coming up, right? Obviously there's a contradiction. Science must be true. Science must be factual, right? It's been proven. Who says, right? Maybe there's a way to understand it where the Bible comes in sync, with science, but that's the assumption. The assumption always is, whatever the contradiction is with the Torah, with the Bible, you're going to assume that the Bible's wrong, right? Someone, not you, someone is going to assume the Bible's wrong. So now, one thing we have to understand, and me being a history major, right? What is history? History is known as his story, right? In other words, how someone is going to give over this information, the vantage point that they're going to see it from. So one thing we have to know for sure, that when it comes to making evaluation, that all ancient history and history in general, a lot of it depends who wrote it, and most of it is written as propaganda, right? Something which this is not deniable. This is undeniable, right? Both the historians and archaeologists are 100% going to agree there's a bias, right? When someone's giving over information, they're not neutral. They are giving it over either one side, another side, a mixture, whatever it is. But when you evaluate information, you have to understand someone's giving the information is 100% biased. When it comes to giving over information of a nation, right, the history may be fudged a little bit, right? In other words, we may see that maybe for 100 years you can't account for certain things. Why not? Because they took it out of the textbook. They didn't write it down. They didn't put it in. Why didn't they put it in? It's embarrassing, right? That we're going to see. So the point of history really is to glorify the contemporary power. And not only that, they are not going to record their own defeats. You tell me, well, aren't people intellectually honest? Most people are not, right? Everyone has their own agenda. We have our agenda. The Christians have their agenda. Muslims have their agenda. Newspaper reports, internet, they have their agenda. But when it comes to ancient history, what are they going to try and show? What are they going to prove? They are going to glorify their power. They're going to show what they did was right and how they were in power. They are not going to record defeat, right? They're not going to be intellectually honest, right? In other words, the scribes with their employees, you can see this, right? For instance, let's say you have a hieroglyphics that Pharaoh X did, raised a great army, conquered a great number of provinces, etc. And his son, Pharaoh X Jr., he did even better, right? Had a larger army, conquered more provinces. And then what happens? He passes that down to Pharaoh X Jr., right? The grandson. Well, the grandson's pretty decadent, right? He's not really into things. And what happens? There's a 100-year gap. There's a 100-year gap, like nothing happened. What happened during those 100 years? So you can't rely, they don't have any documents. So where do you have to go? So let's say, who's living nearby? Go to Babylon. You go to the Babylonian records. What do the Babylonian records show during those 100 years? They are beating the absolute stuffing out of the Egyptians. One war, second war, third war. They absolutely ripped them to shreds. Babylonians have all kinds of documentation. This is what we did, how many people were killed, what cities we took over, what provinces, who we put in as governors, and all these different things. They get all the information. What happened to the Egyptians? Why are they all of a sudden silent? Because they got stuffed. They got demolished. They got annihilated, right? So why are they going to put all their defeats, one after another after another? They don't record it. Right? The Egyptians aren't going to record it because it doesn't glorify their empire. So what do? It's a third and long. It's a punt. What do? They leave it out. But if you go to another country nearby, you see what's going on, then you can make a picture, right? Then you can see what's happening, right? They're getting beaten left and right. Why in the world are they going to admit that? Why in the world are they going to put that out there to show, the glorious Egyptian empire? No, 100 years later, when they take over, they get back in power, that's when history restarts, right? So now, what's a very good example, according to the Torah, to show this? None other than the Exodus. Exodus from Egypt. Now, it's interesting. You look in history, You look in history, no mention by the Egyptians. No mention of the Exodus. As a side point, we know and we understand no nation that Egypt ever took over. They were the world power. No nation that the Egyptians ever took over ever escaped, except one. And that was L'maala min hateva. That was above nature. That's why God had to take them out, show them miracles or whatever, because according to nature, this is why Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't want to go. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I can't take them out according to nature. He looks in the stars and he says, God, they're not coming out. Right? What does he see? He sees he sees an angel of the Egyptians. Every nation has their guardian angel to plea in front of God for different things. And he saw an angel of God of the Jewish people. Both the angels are intertwined like a double helix, like a DNA molecule. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, God, come on. You're going to send me down to Egypt? Not only are they not going to listen to me, the Jews aren't coming out. 100 times out of 100. So God looks at him and goes, Mo, says, Mo, what are you worried about? I'm above nature. I'm in nature. I'm beyond nature. So the Jews come out 100% miraculously. But guess what? The Egyptians don't say boo. There is no mention in the Egyptian records that mentions the Exodus. Right? Now, what's one very simple answer? So we explained, right? They are not going to write in the history books. They failed. Right? Not only that, they were the only nation ever escaped. Right? So it doesn't glorify them. So since the Exodus was a massive defeat, right? You know, all their men got killed, right? They chased after the Jews. You had no animals. You had no agriculture. All the wealth taken out. That's a pretty massive defeat. They got demolished, by the Jews, by their God, etc. So the absence of their records. Now, what is someone going to say? Well, shouldn't the Egyptians write about it? If they didn't write about it, there's good evidence to say it didn't happen. That's not true. Why isn't it true? It's not true for one very simple reason. They're not going to put out there their defeats. Their stinging defeats they're not going to put in the history books. So that doesn't mean, the obvious thing is that someone's going to say, well, there should be evidence. There should be tons of evidence. But there isn't, right? So one way to explain that there isn't evidence is not that the Exodus didn't happen. It's the fact the Egyptians didn't put it in, right? They're not gonna put in the fact that they got demolished by the Jewish people. Now, if you're talking about accuracy of ancient history, right? What's the key question gonna be? Key question is going to be, which is really the topic. This is all introduction, right? That's why I got another hour and a half to go, right? The key question is going to be archaeology. Now, archaeology normally is going to uncover evidence either that event happened or they didn't happen. So we're gonna speak. A lot of this comes from the book called Biblical Personalities in Archaeology, written by Leah Bronner. I'm going to use this book as a reference. And that 100 years ago, it was assumed, right? We'll go into history a little bit. It was assumed that biblical history goes back, that we can show to King David and Solomon, right? That history, more or less, right, according to this, is pretty accurate, right? We don't have too many questions. Bertrand Russell, in his book History of the Western Civilization, presumes that David and Solomon were real kings. Right, that he doesn't have a problem with, right? But beyond that, the prevailing view was, well, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, maybe they were a myth, maybe it was just stories invented to glorify, mythical things. Even though the Christians agree that they certainly existed, right? The Muslims, as well. Regardless of that. Maybe it's to say, and that's probably where a lot of the skeptics are today, they say, how do I know it's true? Show me clear-cut evidence that it's true, right? So therefore over here, to say that it's non-existence, right? In other words, maybe we just created it. Maybe we just created the whole thing. Maybe, the Greeks, maybe did that. Could be the Jews did the same thing. Created all kinds of fantastical things. No proof. Right? No evidence. Now, how do I know? Right? That's going to be really the crux of the issue. How do I know if something's really true, especially if it goes back thousands of years? And I don't really have so much evidence, or let's see. How do I know if it's true or it's a myth? Right? Maybe people write myth projects for all kinds of, it could be any number of reasons why. Right? It could be going to their past conditions of existence, other things. But the problem is going to be, what happened before that? What happened, let's say, 500 to 1,000 years before? Right? 500 to 1,000 years before, very different generation, right? Very different times going on. If you come across, any old timers still alive, that went through World War II, before and after is like a whole different world, right? Totally different world, that we live in. So they can assume, which is a false assumption. We're going to see why. Maybe they're going to assume that life was more or less the same. Right now, it's a bad assumption. We're going to see why, right? But they're going to assume that even if we go back, okay, I can understand 50 years back, 100 years back, something like that, we can still see evidence, right? We can still get evidence. What about another 500 years back before that? So what would I assume? I would assume what's going on today is not that much different than what happened 500 years ago. It just evolved, right? It just went over time. So, okay, maybe things changed a little bit, whatever. But the reality is maybe everything was more or less the same, right? So what's an example? An example is they may have projected back weapons. They may have said we had all these weapons and different things, but way back when, they didn't have them, right? Maybe they had domesticated animals that maybe they didn't have. Trade routes they didn't have, settlements. There could be many, many things that they're going to claim were also in existence back then, and they're making assumptions. They don't have proof. They don't even have clear-cut proof, right? They don't have anything. They're assuming what happened 500 years ago or longer is similar to what's going on today. So that was the same assumption about the biblical account of the history before David and Solomon. Maybe the same things are going on during, previous to that. But that's not necessarily true. Why not? Because archaeology has revealed total opposite. What does the archaeology have revealed? A myriad of details, tremendous amount of details that the records in the Bible speak about the quality of life, conditions of life, certainly of the patriarchs, which turn out to be 100% accurate. And not only that, the seemingly inexplicable, right? In other words, if you're talking about a myth, right? If you're talking about a myth, maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't happen, right? And you're going to say, well, things stayed the same. I don't know how you make such a claim, right? Because if something else comes up that they find, you look like an idiot, because you're going to make a claim and say, no, they didn't have these type of weapons. They didn't have these type of things. They went through the same things, previous generations, blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden, what happens? Years later, they start uncovering things. They start finding things. So you're saying it's a myth. That's your assumption, but you got no proof, right? You absolutely have no proof. So, which is kind of ironic because they're going to say, well, maybe, I'm not really sure, right? How can it be proven, right? And if I have a contradiction, it shows the Torah is not true. Let's see, right? Abraham, for instance, if we follow where he went, Abraham is never associated with the northern part of Israel. If you read the Bible, what does it tell me? He was down south. He was in the Negev, right? He was in Beersheba, right? That's where the Akedah, that's where the binding of Yitzchak takes place, right? Even though it takes place really in the Temple Mount, but where did he go afterwards? In Beersheba. He's in the south. It was probably 150 degrees there as well this week, right? It's pretty darn hot over there. Good. He's in the south. Now, in the period to which Abraham is assigned by the Bible, what happened to the north? What happened in the north? North wasn't settled, right? 100% the north wasn't settled. So now there's a myth being made up that what? The northern land was settled. They're claiming it was settled. Now, if someone's writing it later and they're projecting the conditions of existence of the past, then there's no reason for them to discriminate against the northern part of Israel. But they got no proof, right? We understand that the northern part of Israel wasn't touched. Why wasn't it touched? There's nobody there, right? It wasn't settled. Why was Abraham in the south? right? Why was he in the south? Because there's nothing in the north, right? They're going to say, well, it was totally settled, so why didn't he go there? He could have gone there as well, right? But it doesn't say he went there. He stayed in, one area. One example. Second example, let's take the names Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Lavan, Laban as he's known, Lavan, Yosef, right? Joseph, they're in common usage when? In the time of the patriarchs. Now, what happened after that? What happened 100 years later, 200 years later, 500 years later? Names seem to disappear. But what happens? They appear in archaeological inscription from that time period. In other words, for the time of the patriarchs, we have these names. They're common names. What happened later? We don't have any inscription, nothing of these names in a later period. So those names are used when? They're used in the book of Genesis. Now, somebody 500 years later, if they're making up this myth, right, and they're going to say, well, these names were used, right? So what happens? They got lucky, right? They happen to get the right names at the right time. But if they're going to claim later in history, right, 100 years later, 200 years later, these names also we assume they were being used. Why do I assume? Why do I make such an assumption? We know the names aren't used, right? They're not used. In other words, someone using a myth, you got to understand they don't have any proof. They're just making a statement and saying, oh, just like it was like this, just like they use the names, during the time of the patriarchs, of course they use the names later, right? That's the assumption. Why do I make such an assumption? I don't have any evidence. I have zero evidence. That's true. And it would seem to show later they didn't use those names, right? So people make assumptions they should never make. That's one example. Another example is the custom of the time that a couple that was childless, what would the husband do? He'd take a handmaid, right? Take a concubine, what we know is a concubine, and you have children with her. Now, what would happen if the original wife's going to have a child, right? In other words, the woman can't get pregnant. The wife can't get pregnant. She gives her a handmaid, and this handmaid gets pregnant. So what happens to the child? So there's a law against being disinherited. In other words, that child should also be able to inherit. So that protects the child, right? It protects the child of the handmaid. Now, this, if we go throughout history, this did not make it in later centuries. So when did it happen? Time of the Bible. Where's the first case we have it? Abraham and Sarah, right? Sarah can't have children, so what does she do? She gives her handmaid Hagar, right? Abraham has a child with her, that's Ishmael, right, etc. And what did the law say? That it's forbidden to expel the child, right? You're not allowed to expel the child. But the problem is, Sarah tells Abraham, what does Sarah say? Get him out, right? Throw him out. Why? Because the Torah tells me that this was very bad. This was very evil in Abraham's eyes, right? Why was it evil? One simple explanation, right? Without this, we could say Abraham, loved his son. Even though, he might have been doing terrible things, he still loved his son, right? If he still loved his son, he's not going to throw him out. He thinks it's too cruel to do, right? But what does God say? Sarah's greater than you, right? She's greater than you in prophecy. She's greater than you in prophecy. Just listen to what she says, right? That's usually the simple explanation. But what do we learn over here? We learn over here, why was it evil? Why was it bad in Abraham's eyes? Because it went against the local law. Well, it went against this law. In other words, normally you weren't allowed to do this, right? You're not allowed to send out the child of a handmaid. This child's going to inherit. So what did Sarah say? Get rid of him. I don't want to see him. He's not going to inherit with my son, right? He's not going to inherit with Yitzchak, with Isaac. Abraham thought this is a terrible thing, right? Why do you think it's a terrible thing? Because it went against the law, right? It went against that law. Now, this was not forbidden in later centuries, but it was only forbidden in that time. In other words, in later centuries, you could do that. So if you had a child with a handmaid, right, you get nothing, right? No, the child doesn't inherit, right? The child doesn't inherit. So that's later, right? That's later. But in that century, in the time of Abraham and Sarah, it was forbidden, right? You weren't allowed to do that. So this has been made up 500 years later, and it's projected. Now, again, keep in mind, listen to the logic. If it's projected on the past, it's inexplicable how they got it right. Because the reality is it should be the opposite. It should totally be the opposite. Later on in life, 500 years later, you're allowed to do this, right? But back then you weren't, right? So therefore, if you're going to project what's going on in your time to previous generations, either you're going to be right or you're going to be wrong, right? And in this case, got lucky, right? Got lucky over here, so to speak, because he got it right. Otherwise, if he got it wrong, he looked kind of silly, because it changed. So there's an argument also about in the Bible itself about camels, about the use of camels. The camels themselves, were they domesticated or were they not domesticated? Now, what does the Torah tell me? The Torah says patriarchs are described as having used camels. What do they use camels for? Transportation. So some say that really it was an anachronism. And really that camels were domesticated later. But that's not true. Why not? Because people then know that their ancestors didn't have camels. It's got, you're making an assumption, and that assumption's out the window because that didn't happen, right? And if they had camels, they would have pictured their ancestors as having them, right? If they would have had camels. So the great ancestors couldn't be less than they. In other words, if they had camels, what? They didn't have camels? How could they not have camels? Camels didn't come into existence. They didn't use them. Again, there's just another way of showing you're projecting the future based on something that you don't know anything about. In other words, you're assuming because what happened in the future must have happened in the past. But there can be changes, right? Things could either be forbidden, could be permitted. All kinds of different things could happen. And you're portraying your idea right now, what's going on hundreds of years later, to what happened before. Now, there's another aspect over here, and that is that there was also ignorance when it came to archaeology, right? In the 8th century before the Common Era, we have what we call the Coniferan tablets in northern Syria. What are these tablets? What do they show? It lists domesticated animals. And guess what? The camel is specifically mentioned as a domesticated animal, right? That's one thing. So in other words, you're making a statement you don't know anything about. And now we have proof, right? We have proof that this is true. Another discovery is a camel in a kneeling position, right? Well, why is that significant? Because dating back to this period, what are we looking at? A rider sitting on a camel. So therefore, what are they saying? They're saying that is an accurate report, right? In other words, they use them to travel and whatever. So we see that's true because this backs it up. It's not a later projection, into the past. It's not saying, oh, we have this now, I must assume like this. We have clear-cut proof that this is what happened. This is the fact. This is how it was used, etc. You're not making an assumption from the present, to the past. So we mentioned Joseph. We're going to use him as an example. There are many things over here dealing with Joseph. One of them, what is the price of a slave? Right? Joseph is sold, if you look at the Torah's account, he's sold for 20 pieces of silver. Now, 20 pieces of silver, that's pretty accurate, right, of a slave in Joseph's time, but not in any other time period. Because in that time period, slaves are much cheaper, right? They were much cheaper, and they got increasingly more and more expensive. So imagine someone 500 years later, right? He's trying to connect the dots. He's going to put in the details. What's he going to say? What's the price of slaves 500 years later? He's not going to get it right because the price of slaves, because of inflation, other things, whatever, the price of slaves gone up 10, 20, 50 times. In the time of Joseph, it was much cheaper. If it's much cheaper, how are they going to say, how are they going to make such a comparison? They can't, right? That's an impossibility. You have the same thing regarding sleeping in Egypt on beds. Why sleeping on beds? Why is this significant? Because in Palestine at that time, what they slept on the ground, right? They didn't sleep on beds. They slept on the ground. And the Torah tells me, in Egypt, they slept on beds. So the Torah tells me, Jacob comes to Egypt. Where did he die? He died sleeping not on the floor. He died sleeping on a bed, right? He died sleeping on a bed. Also, Joseph himself is second in command. Joseph is the viceroy in Egypt during that period. And he stands before Pharaoh. And what did he have to have done to him? He had to be shaved. Why did he have to be shaved? Because Pharaoh himself, Pharaohs that time, they were shaved, right? They couldn't grow a beard. He had to be clean shaven. So they put a collar around his neck, a ring upon his finger, etc. And they shaved him. So how do I know this to be true? Because there are hieroglyphics that speak about this whole procedure, right? And of riding in a chariot second to the king. That they have hieroglyphics to show, right? All those details, all those things, again, are accurate. Now, at least for the details, right? We can see a lot of these details are corroborated by archaeology. So maybe I would assume it was written later. It was projected on the past, right? Maybe that would be the assumption. But we see that doesn't hold up, right? And that's certainly not correct because there could be many, many factual mistakes, that are going to creep in. You're going to say, well, hindsight's 20/20. So, we'll wait, we'll wait and then we'll speak about what happened, with accuracy once we have all our dominoes in a row. Once I have all the information, good, I'll write it down. That's not what they did. What did they do? They made predictions, right? They said, oh, this is a myth. Oh, it didn't happen like this. Oh, it didn't happen like that. But their archaeologists look like fools because they're making claims. They're making claims that get proved later, right? So we see that by Yosef. Now, it doesn't mean across the board there aren't issues, right? There aren't issues between archaeology and the Bible. So certainly there are issues, and you got to look at the issues to understand what type of problems that we're talking about. We can't say, wow, there's a contradiction. What do I understand? It must be the Torah is not true, right? It must be, archaeology is true or science is true, and whatever. We'll knock out the Bible, right? What's a good example? Good example is the coming out of Egypt. Is the Exodus. Why? Because the Exodus took place. Now, how am I going to evaluate if it's true? I need evidence. I need archaeological evidence. So what kind of archaeological evidence would you expect to find? You'd expect to find, somewhere speaking about large number of people leaving Egypt. What are we going to find? You'll find implements. You'll find clothing. You'll find vessels. You find all kinds of things, weapons. All kinds of things that if they're going in the desert, you dig long enough, you're bound to find something. I mean, 3 million people, 3 million people. If that's the case, that come out of Egypt, then there has to be a whole slew of evidence, of archaeological evidence. So where's the evidence? Not only that, where are the bones? What about people who died? Right? There must have been tens of thousands that died. Right, as well. Not everyone made it out of the desert into the promised land. We know, many didn't make it out. So if that's the case, where are the bodies? Right, there should be bones. They didn't disintegrate. Right, so what happened over here? So seemingly, there's no evidence. We don't have any archaeological evidence for any of this. Okay, so someone's going to say, you know what? We don't have any archaeological evidence. It must be that the Bible, the Torah, is not true, right? That must be the logical conclusion. Now, the question's going to be, okay, if I'm looking at the Exodus, what am I testing, right? Am I testing the fact that the story is true, that the Jews actually came out of Egypt. Is that what I'm testing? Right? Because if I'm testing that, you have to test it in other ways, right? On its own terms. And therefore, you can't accept part of it and not the other part. In other words, if I accept it, I accept it. You know, if I don't accept it, okay. But what happens if I find a certain amount of evidence? If I find a certain amount of archaeological evidence, it doesn't mean that if I don't find the other part, that I say, oh, the Torah is not true. All I need to find is a few things that corroborate, you know, and that's it, right? It's not going to be, you know, a person, you know, and people do this all the time. What someone's going to do is they're going to take one element. They're going to take one element out of the story, and then they're going to graft it into any of these other, I don't know, hypotheses and testing it, you know, and all that, you know, no one believes it, right? That obviously isn't fair because you're not looking at the full picture, right? In other words, you know, we're going to believe 100%, you know, that story 100% is true, regardless of whether there's evidence or not. But you can't pull out, even if there is some evidence or a small amount of evidence, you can't now come along and say, you know what, good, I'm glad you have evidence for that, but you don't have evidence for this, you don't have evidence for that, and evidence for the other thing. Okay, but I have something. If I have something that corroborates the story or part of the story, why do I assume, as a myth, why do I assume everything else isn't true? Right? That is not inherent logic. Right? That doesn't make sense. If I prove certain things, it could be okay. I don't have the other proof. It doesn't matter. I don't really need the other proof at all because I already have a certain amount right now. And once I have that, it corroborates it. The other stuff doesn't really matter. So in the case now, so when we say about the Exodus, you're going to say, where are the bones? Where are the clothes? You know, how come there's no evidence? Well, the Torah tells me during the 40-year period that they're in the desert. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 4. What does the Torah tell me? During the 40-year period, their clothing didn't wear out. They didn't have to change their clothes. So if you're going to look in the desert, you're going to start combing the desert looking for clothing, scattered clothing all over, you're not going to find it, right? That, you know, you're not testing the Bible, right? Why aren't you testing the Bible? Because the Bible tells you, right? The Bible tells you you're not going to find it, right? That's one thing. So if you're looking for clothing, right? Nobody believes that, right? If nobody believes the Bible, then what's the point? Right? To test the biblical story, again, you have to have other types of evidence, right? But if you want to know why there's no clothing, right? Just as one example, right? We're going to see other examples in a second. If you want to know why there's no clothing, well, the Torah tells me. I don't believe in the Torah. You got a better explanation? So where is it? Right? Where's the clothing? Should be there. Something should be there. I don't know, moccasins, shoes, sandals, something, you know, Reeboks. Got to find something, right? Nikes, you didn't find anything, nothing there. So what about the bones? What about the fact that they didn't find any bones? Now, the Bible doesn't say anything, right? Bible doesn't say anything about the fact of how people died, right? It comes on the Medrash. Now, the Medrash says exactly what happened. It says each year in the 9th of Av, what did they do in the desert? They dug a mass grave. When they dug a mass grave, everybody lay down in the grave. In the morning, those who survived got up, and the rest that God didn't want, they died. Right? They were covered up. That was their grave. Now, they didn't die from time to time. So every day, more or less, you know, you should have them scattered over the desert, but they're not. Right? The Medrash says clear, right? That whatever, they were taken care of. They were put in this mass grave. So how come they didn't find it? Whatever. They didn't find it. But the assumption is, if so many people died, right? People had to die. If people died, they should have been strewn all over the place. You should have found bones. You can say, well, maybe they're 40 miles underneath. Maybe they're whatever. They should have been scattered. Should have been found somewhere, right? Not only that, Not only that, Sinai Desert, right? Anyone knows it's a pretty big place. Plenty of sand, sand, dust, right? So you're talking about thousands of years, right? Sand shifting over a period of how many years? 3,000 years, give or take. Now the question is going to be, if I'm looking for bones, right? I'm walking in the desert. Where in the world am I going to dig? if the desert actually changed, right? Which I would assume there's a shift, right? If there's a shift over time, that's not a big assumption. If there's a shift over time, where in the world am I looking? I have no idea where I'm looking, right? And not only that, even if I dug, I dug here, I dug there, I dug somewhere else, even to take into account the shift, what are the odds I'm going to find anything? Right? It's not even 39 burial places, because in certain places, they could have stayed for many years. Maybe they're only 20 burial places in the entire Sinai Desert, till they left. So maybe, so imagine you're looking for 20 burial places, these are the sands of an hourglass, right? You're looking for a needle in a haystack. You're looking for a needle in sand, right? Thousands of miles of sand on either side, right? So I can say when I went from Eilat, which is the furthest tip on the south, of Israel. I went to Egypt. It was pretty funny. I was on this bus going to Egypt. It was like more than 20 years ago, and the bus is going, and I keep seeing signs. 400 kilometers. 250 miles, 300 miles to Cairo, to Egypt. But all I see is dust. All I see is desert, and nothing else. Dust to the right. Dust to the left, sand, more sand, more sand, all these things. We get closer, 150 kilometers, right? Another 75 miles, 80 miles, nothing. All I see is sand, right? 20 kilometers, nothing but sand. 10 kilometers, nothing. 5 kilometers, all of a sudden you're starting to see something, right? You see what almost looks like a city, right? You can see the outskirts. But everything else is desert. It's desert. Where in the world, what are you going to find? Let's say, again, in the entire desert, you're looking for 20 graves over thousands of miles. It'll take you forever. Dig here, dig there, dig every. You're never going to find it, right? So finding 20 burial places, something like 3 square blocks. So you're going to say, see, they didn't find any bodies. How in the world are they going to find bodies over here? You're looking for a needle in a haystack, right? That's not evidence, right? That's not the kind of evidence you're looking for. That's no proof at all, because it doesn't go against the fact that the Exodus happened. Why not? Very simple. Even if they weren't there for a very long time, and I'm looking for a very small amount of graves, 10, 15, 20, a 3-block radius, let's say, in tens of thousands of miles of sand. That's it. It doesn't mean the Exodus didn't happen. It just means they're never going to find it, right? Even if they dug, they spent all their money, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and they scatter all over the desert. They're going to find it? A needle in a haystack, right? They may eventually find it, but if they don't find it, if they dig and dig and dig and all over and they don't find it, it's not evidence against the fact that the Exodus didn't happen, right? It just means you're looking for a needle in a haystack. So there's a famous archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, that excavated Jericho. So she says, now this is going to be a problem with archaeology. We're going to answer up here. But what does she say? She says, what's the best date that she comes up with for the entry of the Jewish people to the land of Israel? Right? When Joshua takes them over, after Moshe Rabbeinu dies, Torah tells me Joshua takes them over into Jericho. So her guess is about 1400 before the Common Era. So she says it's about 150 years. There's a gap between the destruction of Jericho and entry of the Jewish people. There's some sort of gap, right? About 150 years. So what does she say? What's her conclusion? Jews couldn't have been the ones responsible before and be responsible for destroying Jericho. Why not? Because they weren't there. right? There's a 150-year gap. Her assumption is most likely they weren't there, right? So they just attribute it why it was. Oh, so why are we saying that we destroyed Jericho again? Just like all the other nations, we want to glorify our nation, so we want to glorify them by saying we took Jericho down. Now, the question is going to be, how does she arrive at this conclusion, right? That it's destroyed no later than 1550 before the Common Era, right? Again, 150-year difference, right? So she details all this in the Biblical Archaeological Review. Sounds pretty interesting. In 1990, anyone wants to look at it. And what's her argument? Her argument is the absence of imported Cypriot pottery, right? Pottery from Cyprus, right? It must be Jericho is this international city, who knows what. And therefore, they're lacking, there's a certain style of pottery, right, of imported pottery. And this certain pottery, when was it imported? It was imported, according to her, from 1550 to 1400, before the Common Era. And what happened? She didn't find any of it, right? Lo and behold, there's no pottery in Jericho. So what's her assumption? So her assumption is Jericho must have been destroyed before. Now, why is this illogical? Why is her conclusion weak? So we got a few different reasons here. One is conclusions based on what you don't find, right? She's looking for something that doesn't exist. So what does she do? She says, okay, the fact that this doesn't exist must mean X. But that's not a proof. How is that a proof? Just because you can't find X doesn't mean Y happened, right? There's no logical reason why, if this didn't happen, then Y did, right? That's one possible answer against it. A second is she claims Jericho is not on any of the major trade routes. Well, if it's not on any one of the trade routes, they ain't going to find pottery, right? Why are they going to find fancy imported pottery in a place that's not on a major trade route, right? It's kind of like, you're driving, all you see is desert, and there's like one gas station for like 100 kilometers, 500 miles, whatever it is. There's one gas station, and, there's like a little town there. That's it. No one else is coming through. It's not like an international hub, right? If it's not an international hub, how are you going to find something imported like pottery? That's the second knock. A third knock is, what did she do? She describes as the poor section of the city of where Jericho was. Well, if that part of the city is poor, where are they going to have imported pottery? Where are they getting imported pottery from? And the fourth thing is, which she totally ignores, the dating of pottery, which had been found in early excavations, comes around the date, dates later than that. So, in the end, it's interesting. The British government knighted her for contributions to archaeology, right? These are four very basic things, very basic questions you could ask on her, quote unquote, on her discovery. But this argumentation is kind of what I'll call, and the English will be happy. Not only is it kind of dodgy, it's sloppy, right? These are logical holes that can be put in her argument. And I guess a few other things here while we're winding down is that archaeology, can also, the last 100 years is a tremendously negative mindset, right? Anyone who's ever, studied it or whatever, it's tremendously negative, right? None of the biblical narrative, right? None of the Torah happened according to them, right? It was all made up. It was a myth. But what happened? They had to eat crow because little by little, piece by piece, they're finding details. They're finding hieroglyphics. They're finding papyrus. They're finding other things that are showing that these things actually happened. They're not finding everything, okay, but I don't need to find everything. All I need to find is a few things to corroborate certain things, and that's it. Even if I don't find the other things, it doesn't matter. Right? Now, the archaeologists are not giving up. They're going to hold on to, whatever they believe, just like the scientists and the cosmologists and, all that, but they're going to say, well, you got to verify, you got to verify everything, but it's gradual, right? It's not going to be, you're going to find everything in one shot, right? But what we do see over time is that we do see certain things that are being proven, right? Over time. That's one thing. And also, we get into their mental state, right? What are they stating at the beginning? The Bible is fantasy. The Bible isn't true, right? What's better? The documentary hypothesis, what we call the Welthausen, hypothesis, which everyone in academia believes. God didn't write the Torah. There are 4 authors and a redactor. Okay, right? But they're starting out with a mental state. Okay, so that's even a level. They're saying documentary hypothesis says, okay, man made everything up. It's divinely inspired. There was a committee, whatever. It wasn't divine. They're saying it never happened. The whole thing never happened, right? So they're starting with a tremendous negative. And now they're eating crow, admitting piece by piece some parts actually have been verified. That they can't deny. 100% have been verified. So therefore kind of problematic for them. Now that's if you're telling me it's on a negative. But sometimes archaeology can be a positive. You can find something, let's say a city that was burnt. It was pillaged. It was destroyed, right? Maybe it was military action. Maybe it was something else. But it's going to be hard for archaeology to establish a negative that something didn't happen when I have it right in front of my face, right? That's another thing. So, they can't say, wow, maybe found it somewhere else. Maybe this isn't the place you thought it was. Maybe these cities gone through, I don't know. Maybe it's a different city with the same name. What a coincidence. It's got the same name. Unbelievable, right? You have to remember, they assumed there were no domesticated camels. Why not? Because they didn't find a certain seal or that particular hieroglyphic or whatever. But then when they found it, guess what? They have to say, you know what? There really were domesticated animals, right? The camels, etc. So a person has to be careful when it comes to archaeology when it claims to find a negative. Because if you're going to tell me the war didn't take place, the settlement wasn't there, this wasn't the king, all these things, you have to take what they say with a grain of salt, because it doesn't mean that what they claim, is necessarily true. If they want to say something positive, okay, right, then they come with credibility. Now, it could be that what they find requires interpretation. Right? Now, interpretation is also not necessarily, reliable. Again, why isn't it reliable? Because they're not basing what they find on Torah. Right? So, unless they absolutely have no choice. Right? What they're going to do is they're going to say, oh, we found this. And if it corroborates with the story, they're cooked. Right? In my language. So archaeology, is still pretty much a still work in progress. And there's plenty what to learn from it. And gradually, again, it's still incomplete, but gradually we're showing verification, of what the Torah says, right? One last thing here, that William Albright, known, famous American archaeologist, William Albright gave an, interesting idea of ancient history and how ancient history worked. So he has proof there was an influence of the Jews on the Greeks. Now, normally we say just the opposite. We say the Greeks had the influence on us when they took over Israel, etc. They put all their things in place. They had an influence on us. So what's his proof? Names of the Hebrew letters of the alphabet. Beginning is, you have an aleph, right? You have a bet, you have a gimel, you have a dalet, the first 4 letters, etc. in Hebrew. What are the letters of the Greek alphabet? Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Right now, these sounds, anyone who knows Greek, right? These sounds have no meaning in Greek, right? If you say to a Greek, oh, alpha, they're going to say, what are you talking about? Right? It's not a word. It's not a Greek word, right? So where'd they get the name for the letters? Comes along Albright. What does Albright say? He says there's a historical archaeological community that certainly has accepted this, and that is they got it from the Jews. It may be indirectly from the Philistines, took them to Greece, whatever it is, but essentially where did it come from? It came from none other than the Jewish people. Now, if the names of the letters of the Greek alphabet came from us, could be other things also came from us. Other types of influence. Names of the letters are pretty fundamental, right? We don't, we're not privy necessarily to other things that they possibly could have taken, because the way people look at the history of the Greeks, what they brought to the world, everything was on them. They didn't learn from anyone else. They brought architecture, education, right? Life of Brian. Hey, they gave us aqueducts. This place was terrible without the aqueducts. Imagine without the roads. They built the roads. They did all these things. But who's to say they didn't get anything from the Jews? If they got certain things like the Hebrew alphabet, part of the Hebrew alphabet, and they're using it for themselves, is it a leap of faith to say they didn't get anything else? No, it's not a leap of faith, right? They quite possibly, could have influenced the Greeks, right? So in the last 35 seconds, right, what do we see over here? Right, we see clear that when there's a negative aspect in archaeology, a lot of it is negative. When it's negative, then you have to be aware of what they're saying. And what they're saying, even if it hasn't happened, they haven't found the proof, doesn't mean it's not true. Because they've eaten a lot of crow over the last number of years, last 100 years, whatever, because they're making discovery after discovery of things that corroborate what the Torah says. They can't say, oh, this is a myth. Well, you could look at them and say, well, I think you're a myth. I don't think you exist existentially, right? But essentially what they're doing step by step is actually showing. Is actually going to show gradual proof, the Torah exists. Are they going to find everything? Not necessarily going to find everything. But again, they don't have to. If they say in a positive way, right? They say in a positive way. And what they say is corroborated good, right? But, they're starting off from a negative position. The negative position is the Torah is not true. The Torah is a big myth. It's a big fantasy. It's all that. So what happens when they get information that actually corroborates what the Torah says? They have no choice. They can't say, oh, this didn't happen. Oh, that didn't happen. But what can they say? They could say, well, we don't have all the evidence. Yeah, we have part of it. We have something, but it doesn't necessarily prove everything. You're right. It doesn't necessarily prove everything, but it proves enough. It proves enough 100% to show that the other stuff, even if I don't have the evidence, you can't, it's very hard to say, wow, that other stuff didn't happen. Why? This part of the Exodus, the book of Exodus talks about this. This we have proof for. The other stuff, even if we don't have proof for it, doesn't mean that's not true. All I need is a certain level of proof. Once I have a certain level of proof, then I can start to say that, then it corroborates what the Torah says. If it corroborates what the Torah says, then I know the Torah is true, and I can look at it from that vantage point, from the vantage point of archaeology.
And that was more than a mouthful. I'm just in case you.
So I gave a class yesterday.
No, that was great.
And I went through 3 different topics in 2 hours. Like, I don't know, I spoke about the Garden of Eden, and hell, and I spoke about the purpose of the mitzvahs, and we got on to prophecy, and we got on to divine providence. So someone at the end said, wow, that was intense. You just went through 5, 2 hours and 3 different topics, and I don't know if I'm still sitting. I'm like, it's a good thing you're sitting, because otherwise you'd have fallen flat. You would have fallen flat in your face.
So first, I'll give you a question followed by a compliment. The question is, and you don't get to speak in between. So the compliment is, no, the question is, how many times did you breathe during the show? That was the question. The compliment is, I've never seen so much information packed into 1 hour. Because there's no breathing involved.
You wouldn't let me go on anymore. Come on, people gotta.
You wanted 2 hours and said you get.
Why in the world you speak so fast? Because you don't give me any time.
That's
Scotty,
funny.
Just give me some time.
You wanted.
Get me to warp 4, even if I don't have any engine.
That's funny. You wanted 2 hours. I said you got 1. Pack it in, buddy. Pack it in.
I packed in 1 into 2. Okay, so.
Oh my gosh.
But I got it in. I got it all in.
You did good. That's awesome. Okay, so guys, if you have any suggestions for next week's show, keep in mind the title of the show, Controversial Issues. We don't want to. I mean, when I say controversial, I'm not talking about politics or who's your best who's your favorite Facebook friend, but about things that are really biblically related. If you want to have a topic discussed, send it to me to knocktalkquestions@gmail.com, or you can find Rabbi Chaim Coffman. If you're not friends with him already, find him on Facebook. You can also follow him on Facebook through Orthodox Conversion. Orthodox.
Beyond Orthodox Conversion to Judaism.
You know, after 3 years, you'd think I'd have that down by now. Or more. Good
It's
Lord.
too much scotch. It's kind of slops the brain. OrthodoxConversion.com is my website.
Right.
It's a blog.
Yep.
And Beyond Orthodox Conversion to Judaism is on Facebook.
For your convenience, I'll put that up on the screen just for a moment here, just because I don't want to have Rabbi call me later and say,
just don't misspell it. So at least people come to me and no one else.
So Beyond Orthodox Conversion to Judaism on Facebook.
Right.
And then OrthodoxConversion.com. If you want to look for him on the actual website. So, Rabbi, thank you again. It's always an interesting and entertaining evening whenever you come on. So
imagine if in the middle I would have gotten lockjaw. Someone asked me, said, "Do you ever get lockjaw?" I'm like, if I got lockjaw, I'm in trouble.
You're crazy. That's okay.
Keep praying I don't get lockjaw. That's it.
All right, we love you anyway. See you next week, everybody. Actually, no, wait. What's the status? So the next 3 weeks is going to be really tricky for people outside of Israel, but you're in Israel, and it's Monday, so you won't have any problems with the shows, except for next week. Next week, we're scheduled off the air because we're going to be traveling. But the following weeks...
The week after is Rosh Hashanah, but
Rosh that's Hashanah not Monday. That's Sunday. Saturday night, Sunday.
It's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So Monday...
Yeah, Monday's good.
Monday, in theory, we should be all right.
Okay, good. And the week following is good, too. Okay, good deal.
No, though I think the week following, is Yom Kippur. I think it's on Sunday night or Monday night.
Oh, I thought it was Saturdays. Oh, okay, gotcha.
I think Yom Kippur's whatever. I have to check, but I think
okay, we'll find out. So just know people when you're watching the show. This whole during the holiday season, the dates whether we're on or off is going to be very tricky. You have to follow like every resource we have available to make sure because I could misinform you just because my dates are a little skewed, but the rabbis kind of know. But I also have rabbis in Israel and then have rabbis who are not in Israel, and the ones that are not in Israel have a 2-day I call it a sabbatical or a break because of the laws of Torah and how to keep the holy days.
Listen, when you're in synagogue for 7 hours a day, it's not a sabbatical. You definitely need a strong drink afterwards because you're like, it's drenched, it's like pleading for your life. Like, oh yeah, it's a sabbatical. We're putting our feet up. We're drinking pina coladas. Oh, sure.
That's what
we're doing.
If you go to the right synagogue, they'll actually provide the drinks for you.
Yeah, probably. That's even on Yom Kippur. God forbid. They probably provide that also. No problem.
I know, that's funny. Guys, thank you so much. Rabbi, thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and I really appreciate what you do. And folks, we'll see you soon. I'll just say soon. Shalom, everybody. Shalom, Rabbi. Take care, everyone. See you. Bye.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד